7 days. That's how long Sandra had to heal before the world collapsed. In the quiet shadows of the maid's quarters, she was tucking a jasmine flower into her newborn daughter's straight hair when the door was kicked open. Dragon stood there, the ink on his neck looking like a living beast in the dim light. He didn't look at the baby. He looked at the security breach file in Brandy's hand. "She's a spy, Dragon," Brandy whispered, her eyes gleaming. "She used you to get the floor plans, and this baby is her leverage." Sandra tried to stand, her body still weak and aching from childbirth, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the man she once thought saw her as human, but Dragon's face was stone. He didn't ask for the truth. He simply pointed to the rain-slicked gates of the Obsidian Manor. "Take your spy and get out," he commanded. In that moment, a healing mother was cast into a freezing midnight with a 1-week-old infant and 0 resources. The world thought she would disappear. They were wrong. This wasn't the end of a maid. It was the birth of a mother's war. The iron gates of the Obsidian Manor hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a guillotine. Sandra didn't look back. She couldn't. The weight of the 1-week-old infant in her arms was the only thing keeping her upright as her body, still raw and aching from the trauma of childbirth, screamed with every step. The Seoul midnight was a predatory cold, the kind that didn't just touch the skin but bit deep into the bone. Sandra adjusted the thin, threadbare shawl around Claudia, tucking the infant's straight hair beneath the fabric, shielding the delicate flowers she had woven into it only hours ago. "We only have each other now," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread in the wind. She stepped onto the rain-slicked pavement, her flat shoes soaking through instantly. The neon lights of Gangnam blurred into long, distorted streaks of pink and blue through her tears. She had no money, no phone, and the most dangerous man in the country had just branded her a traitor. Every black car that hummed past felt like a hunter. Every shadow in a doorway felt like a trap. Her goal was no longer to find comfort, but simply to find a pocket of air where the dragon's fire couldn't reach them. High above, on the glass-rimmed balcony of the penthouse, Dragon stood like a statue carved from shadow. The wind whipped his white shirt, making the black ink of the dragon on his neck appear to writhe in the moonlight. He watched the small, retreating figure in the red coat until she was nothing more than a speck against the gray concrete. For a fraction of a second, his hand twitched toward the railing. A cold, sharp stone of doubt turned in his chest. The way she had looked at him wasn't the look of a spy. It was the look of a woman who had been hollowed out. She played her part well, didn't she? Brandy's voice was like silk sliding over a blade. She stepped up behind him, her manicured hand resting on his shoulder, her thumb tracing the edge of his tattoo. "The innocent made with the mystery child. It's a classic play, Dragon. If you hadn't caught the transmission, she would have sold your head to the highest bidder by morning." Dragon's jaw tightened, the doubt vanishing behind a wall of frozen pride. "She's gone," he said, his voice a low growl. "She's nothing to the Empire now." But as he turned to go inside, he didn't see the dark, calculating glint in Brandy's eyes, nor did he hear the soft vibration of a burner phone hidden in her silk robe. Sandra was blocks away now, collapsing against a cold brick wall in a dark alley, her strength finally failing. As she slid to the ground, the sound of heavy boots splashing through the puddles echoed from the entrance of the alley. Sandra clutched Claudia tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs, as a jagged shadow stretched across the wet bricks toward her. The shadows in the alley didn't belong to a hunter, but to a memory. An elderly woman, herself a ghost of the city's forgotten corners, had reached out not with a weapon, but with a heavy wool blanket and a card for a place called the Glass Garden. It was there, amidst the scent of damp earth and crushed petals, that Sandra found her sanctuary. The shop was a tiny, glass-fronted sliver of life squeezed between towering gray skyscrapers, owned by a woman who asked no questions about the bruises on a soul or the origin of a fatherless child. In the back room, tucked between crates of imported lilies, Sandra built a world. While the city of Seoul hummed with the cold ambition of men like Dragon, Sandra's days became a rhythmic montage of survival and defiance. She traded her silk maid's apron for a canvas one stained with green chlorophyll and soil. Her hands, once soft from polishing silver, grew calloused and strong. Every morning, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, she would sit with Claudia, weaving fresh blossoms into the girl's straight, raven hair. "Look at me, Claudia," Sandra would whisper, her voice firm even when her stomach was empty. "You are not a secret. You are not a mistake. You come from the earth and the stars, and you bow to no one." As the years blurred, the Middle Eastern heritage in Claudia's features flourished into a breathtaking, ethereal beauty that stopped passers-by in their tracks. Her skin was the color of warm desert sand, her eyes deep and amber, reflecting a wisdom that far outpaced her age. She didn't just wear flowers, she seemed to command them. While other children played with plastic toys, Claudia spent her hours in the shop, speaking to the roses as if they were her subjects. She carried herself with a serene, natural royalty that Sandra carefully nurtured, a quiet dignity that was a direct, silent protest against the man who had cast them into the cold. Sandra worked double shifts, skipping meals to ensure Claudia had the best books and a coat that was never tattered. She was no longer just a woman who had been discarded. She was a woman who was cultivating a masterpiece. By the time Claudia was 7, the small flower shop had transformed into a thriving boutique, known across the district for its royal arrangements. Sandra was no longer a maid. She was an architect of a new life, her name whispered in high society circles for her impeccable taste. But the past is a debt that eventually collects. One humid Tuesday afternoon, a black luxury sedan, a ghost from a nightmare Sandra thought she had escaped, pulled up to the curb of the glass garden. The door opened, and a man in a bespoke suit stepped out, holding a gold-embossed invitation. As he entered the shop, his eyes fell directly on Claudia, who was sitting on a stool weaving a crown of jasmine. The man froze, his breath catching as he looked at the girl's face, then at the distinctive silver-etched bracelet on her wrist. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at the girl as if he had just seen a dead man walk. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling as he dialed a number that Sandra had spent years trying to forget. While Sandra's life was blooming in the soil of the glass garden, the Obsidian Manor was slowly being consumed by a winter that had nothing to do with the weather. The halls that once carried the faint, warm scent of Sandra's vanilla perfume now smelled of nothing but cold marble and expensive, bitter floor wax. Dragon sat in his study, the darkness of the room punctuated only by the glowing tip of a cigar. The empire he had built felt heavier than ever, a crown of lead that seemed to grow more burdensome with every passing hour. He felt the phantom absence of a quiet presence, the way the tea was always exactly at his preferred temperature, and the way the morning light seemed softer when Sandra moved through the rooms. He was a man who ruled through fear, but for the first time, he felt the chill of isolation. His empire was rotting from the inside, but he was too blinded by his own pride to see the source. Brandy moved through the manor like a silent, predatory cat. Her high heels clicked across the foyer with a rhythm that signaled the end of careers and loyalties. Under the guise of tightening security, after Sandra's supposed betrayal, she was systematically dismantling the dragon's inner circle. That afternoon, she stood in the shadows of the secondary office, a stack of termination papers in her hand. One by one, she summoned the guards who had served the clan for decades, men who remembered the day Dragon took his first oath. "The boss doesn't tolerate loose ends," Brandy lied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she handed a veteran guard his final check. "He thinks you're part of the cell Sandra was working for. If I were you, I'd take this and leave the city before he changes his mind about letting you live." She was erasing the witnesses to her greed, replacing loyal soldiers with mercenaries whose only allegiance was to the highest bidder, her. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the manor was filled with strangers. Dragon walked through the corridors that night, his hand tracing the dragon tattoo on his neck. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He stopped at the door to the old maid's quarters, his hand hovering over the handle. He hadn't let anyone enter that room in years, but tonight, the silence was too loud. He pushed the door open, expecting to find dust and emptiness. Instead, his breath caught. The room was pristine, exactly as it had been left, but on the floor near the bassinet lay a small, dried object that had been missed in the rush of the eviction. He knelt, his large, tattooed fingers trembling as he picked up a withered, pressed white flower. As he held it, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a restricted alert from his financial monitoring team. The message was short: internal accounts compromised. Final destination, a private offshore bank under the name Brandy. Dragon's eyes turned to liquid fire. He surged to his feet, but as he reached for his weapon, the lights in the manor flickered once and then died completely. From the hallway, he heard the heavy, synchronized cocking of multiple rifles, sounds that didn't belong to his men. The darkness in the Obsidian Manor was not just a power failure, it was a premonition. But while Dragon stood in the shadows of his rotting empire, miles away, Sandra was standing in the light. 7 years had turned the panicked girl in the rain into a woman of titanium and silk. The glass garden was no longer just a shop. It had evolved into an elite floral and catering empire that the high society of Seoul whispered about in reverent tones. Sandra had become a ghost of a different kind, a prestigious, anonymous architect of beauty whose work was everywhere, yet whose face remained a mystery to the elite. She had scrubbed the Maid from her skin, replacing it with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had built a kingdom out of thorns. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, embossed in gold on heavy, black cardstock. The Dragon Empire's Decade Gala. It was the most dangerous contract in the city, and the most lucrative. Sandra sat at her mahogany desk, the light catching the sharp, intelligent curve of her jaw. She traced the embossed dragon logo with a callous thumb. For years, she had avoided the district surrounding the Obsidian Tower, but her business had grown too large to remain in the shadows. The gala committee had sought her out specifically for her royal jasmine arrangements, the very flowers that had once decorated a bassinet in a cold room. "Mother, are you okay?" Claudia's voice drifted in from the greenhouse. At 7 years old, the girl was a mirror of a heritage Dragon had denied. Her straight, raven hair was tucked behind her ears, and her amber eyes held a depth that felt ancient. "I'm more than okay," Sandra whispered, her voice a low, steady hum of resolve. "It's time to show them what we've grown." The night of the gala, the Obsidian Tower was a monolith of light and glass. Inside, Dragon moved through the crowd like a shark in dark water. He was thinner, his dragon tattoos stark against his pale skin, his eyes scanning the room with a hunger he couldn't name. He had spent months purging his ranks, but the isolation had only deepened. He looked at the floral arrangements, towering, impossible structures of jasmine and white roses that seemed to breathe with the room. They felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream of warmth. "Who did this?" Dragon asked, his voice a raspy growl, stopping the event coordinator mid-sentence. "A new firm, sir. The Obsidian Lily. They've stayed in the kitchen to manage the service personally," the man stammered. Dragon turned, his gaze narrowing as a side door opened. A woman stepped out, draped in a gown of shimmering midnight blue, her natural hair styled into a crown of sophisticated coils. She wasn't carrying a tray. She was carrying herself like she owned the air in the room. Behind her, a small girl with straight hair and amber eyes followed, holding a single, fresh white flower. The air in the ballroom seemed to vanish. Dragon froze, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in 7 years. But as he took a step forward, his eyes locked onto something else. Across the room, hidden behind a marble pillar, Brandy was signaling to a waiter, who wasn't holding a drink, but a silenced pistol aimed directly at the small girl's heart. The heavy double doors of the Obsidian Manor didn't creak. They hummed with the sound of expensive machinery and ancient, heavy wood. 7 years ago, Sandra had been shoved through these doors into a freezing downpour. Tonight, she walked through them by invitation, her heels clicking against the marble with a steady, percussive rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. She was no longer wearing the faded cotton of a maid's uniform. She was draped in a shimmering midnight blue gown that caught the light like the surface of a deep ocean. Beside her, Claudia walked with a practiced, ethereal grace, a single white jasmine flower tucked into her straight, raven hair, a silent, living signature of their survival. The air inside the foyer was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of cold authority. Sandra felt the weight of the house trying to crush her, to remind her of the nights she spent scrubbing these very floors until her knuckles bled. But she kept her chin parallel to the ground, her eyes fixed forward. She wasn't here to serve. She was here to conquer the space they had claimed she didn't belong in. At the top of the grand staircase, Dragon stood like a ghost of his own making. The light from the massive crystal chandelier hit the black ink of the dragon on his neck, but tonight, the tattoos didn't look like symbols of power. To Sandra, they looked like shackles, heavy, dark chains that kept him anchored to a throne of isolation. He looked thinner, his face more angular, the hollows beneath his eyes speaking of a man who had forgotten how to sleep. Dragon's hand tightened on the banister as his gaze fell on her. He had expected a vendor, a faceless business owner to manage the gala's opulence. He had not expected the woman whose memory he had tried to burn out of his mind. The transformation was so total, so absolute, that for a moment his breath hitched in his chest. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a woman of titanium and silk, radiating a quiet power that made the polished marble around her look dull. He began to descend the stairs, his eyes locked on hers, a storm of regret and confusion brewing in his dark pupils. He didn't see the gala guests. He saw only the woman he had cast out. But as he reached the bottom step, his eyes shifted to the small girl standing at Sandra's side. He saw the straight hair, the amber eyes, and the defiant way she held her head. A shock of recognition, violent and sudden, ripped through him. It was a face from a portrait in the manor's restricted wing, a face he hadn't seen in decades. Sandra saw the realization hit him, but she didn't offer a smile or a word of comfort. She simply adjusted the jasmine in Claudia's hair. Before Dragon could speak, the heavy silence was shattered by a sharp, panicked gasp from the balcony above. Brandy stood there, her face ashen, clutching a glass so tightly it threatened to shatter. She wasn't looking at Sandra. She was looking at the small, silver-etched bracelet on Claudia's wrist. A family heirloom Brandy had claimed was lost the very night she framed Sandra. The trap was set, but as the first notes of the gala's orchestra began to play, the main lights of the ballroom suddenly died, leaving them all in a terrifying, suffocating darkness. The silence that followed the flickering lights was more deafening than any shout. As the backup generators hummed to life, a dim, amber glow bathed the foyer, casting long, dancing shadows against the marble. Claudia, sensing the shift in the room's energy, didn't shrink back. Instead, she stepped forward with the serene, unshakable confidence Sandra had spent 7 years instilling in her. She adjusted the jasmine crown in her straight, raven hair, the white petals stark against the dark silk of her locks. In the corner of the room, seated in a high-backed velvet chair, was Lady Myung, the clan's eldest matriarch and the only person Dragon truly feared. She had been silent all evening, a ghost of the old world watching the new one decay. But as Claudia stepped into a pool of light, Lady Myung's cane hit the floor with a sharp, echoing crack. The elderly woman's face, usually a mask of wrinkled stone, collapsed into a look of absolute, terrifying shock. She let out a piercing, ragged scream that cut through the gala's low murmur like a blade. "Spirit," she wailed, her thin hand trembling as she pointed at Claudia. "The spirit of the moon has returned." The gala guests froze. Dragon reached out to steady his aunt, but she pushed his hand away, her eyes locked on Claudia with a hunger that bordered on religious fervor. "Look at her hair. Look at the way she carries the blossoms." Myung hissed, her voice a frantic whisper that carried across the ballroom. "Seo-jun, look at her face. She is the living image of your mother. She is the image of the woman who founded this empire, the woman you swore to honor." Dragon's world tilted on its axis. He looked at Claudia, really looked at her, and saw the impossible. It wasn't just the straight hair or the amber eyes. It was the specific, regal tilt of her chin and the way she stood, feet planted firmly, as if the earth itself belonged to her. It was a resemblance so genetic, so ancient, that no lie from Brandy could ever erase it. It was a blood signature written in flesh and bone. Across the room, the color drained from Brandy's face until she looked like a corpse in a designer gown. She saw the elders leaning in, their suspicious gazes shifting from the child to her. She saw the way Dragon's hand moved instinctively to his throat, his fingers brushing the dragon tattoo, as if he were choking on his own pride. "It's a trick," Brandy shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. Sandra found a look-alike. "She's trying to steal the legacy." But Lady Myung was already moving, hobbling toward the center of the room with a renewed, frantic strength. She ignored Sandra and went straight for Claudia, her eyes fixed on the small, silver-etched bracelet on the girl's wrist. "The box," Myung breathed, her voice trembling. "Bring the Founder's box. If she is who the stars say she is, the heavens will answer tonight." As the guards hurried to fetch the heavy, iron-bound relic from the vault, a sudden, violent crash echoed from the kitchen. A group of masked men burst through the service doors, guns raised, and the lead intruder didn't point his weapon at Dragon. He pointed it directly at Lady Myung, his finger tightening on the trigger as he screamed a command that made Sandra's blood run cold. The chaos of the intruders was silenced not by a gun, but by the sheer, terrifying authority of Lady Myung. "Lower your weapons," she thundered, her voice echoing with the power of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall. "The Founder's box is here. Let the heavens decide who belongs to this house and who is merely a parasite." The heavy, iron-bound chest was placed on a central marble plinth. It was a relic of the old world, etched with silver dragons that seemed to writhe under the ballroom's amber lights. Legend held that the box contained the original seal of the Dragon Empire, protected by a mechanism that responded only to the specific biorhythms, the very blood of the true lineage. Brandy stepped forward, her face a mask of sweating desperation. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, though her hands were shaking. "I am the one who has stood by Dragon for 7 years. I am the one who belongs here." She reached out, her manicured fingers gripping the cold silver latch. She pulled, then jerked, her knuckles turning white. The box remained as motionless as a mountain. It didn't just stay closed. It seemed to repel her, the cold metal biting into her skin. "It's jammed," Brandy shrieked, looking at the guards. "The lock is rusted." Lady Myung didn't even look at her. She turned her gaze to Claudia. "Child, come." Sandra felt the world tilt. She looked down at her daughter, the girl whose hair was still adorned with the jasmine of the common streets, yet who carried the blood of kings. She squeezed Claudia's hand once, then let go. Claudia walked to the plinth. She didn't struggle with the latch. She didn't show fear. With a serene grace that silenced every breath in the room, she placed her small, warm hand over the silver dragon's head on the lid. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a soft, mechanical thrum vibrated through the floorboards. A series of internal gears began to turn with a melodic, metallic song. With a crisp, definitive click, the heavy lid swung open on its own, revealing a shimmering gold seal and a stack of ancient, handwritten letters. Dragon took a step forward, his eyes wide, his soul shattering as he looked at the open box. He looked at the letters, then at the girl, then at Sandra. The truth wasn't just revealed, it was screaming. But as the elders bowed their heads in recognition, Brandy's face twisted into something demonic. She didn't look at the box. She looked at the lead intruder, who was still standing by the service door. She gave a sharp, subtle nod. Suddenly, the man didn't aim for the elders. He aimed his weapon directly at the open box, and the child standing next to it, just as the floor beneath the plinth began to groan with the sound of a pre-planted explosive charge. The rumble of the pre-planted explosive was muffled by the thick marble, but the tremor was enough to send a ripple through the crystal chandeliers. Amidst the panic, Sandra didn't flinch. While the guests scrambled, she stepped toward the open Founder's box, her eyes locking onto the ancient, handwritten letters tucked beneath the golden seal. "The heavens didn't just answer through a child's touch," Sandra's voice rang out, cutting through the rising hysteria like a cold blade. They left a paper trail. She reached into the shimmering midnight blue folds of her gown and pulled out a digital tablet, flicking it toward the massive projection screen meant for the gala's celebratory montage. Instead of the Dragon Empire's history, the screen filled with thousands of archived messages and offshore bank transfers. 7 years ago, Sandra began, her gaze leveling at Dragon, who stood paralyzed between the past and the present. I was thrown out because of a security breach. But look at the timestamp on these files, Dragon. The breach happened before I was even pregnant. The floor plans were leaked by someone with executive access, someone who needed a ghost to blame so they could bleed this empire dry. She pointed a steady finger at Brandy, whose face was now a frantic mask of twitching nerves. The reason I was sent out wasn't that I was a spy. It was because Brandy found out I carried a true heir. She knew that if a child with the founder's mark was born, your focus would shift. She couldn't rob a man who was building a legacy for his daughter. She needed you alone, cold, and paranoid. The crowd went silent as a specific document appeared on the screen. A falsified lab report from 7 years ago, signed by Brandy's private doctor, recommending Sandra's immediate removal for the safety of the clan. Beneath it was the true motive, a transfer of $50 million to an account in Brandy's name, labeled Exit Strategy. Dragon turned slowly toward Brandy. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The dragon tattoo on his neck pulsed with the heavy beat of his heart. "You stole my daughter's first 7 years," he whispered, a sound more terrifying than his loudest shout. "You made me a monster to my own blood." Brandy didn't beg. Seeing the game was over, she lunged for the small, silenced pistol tucked into her garter. "If I can't have the Empire, no one will," she shrieked. But as her finger tightened on the trigger, a secondary, much larger explosion rocked the foyer. The floor beneath the plinth buckled, and a cloud of white marble dust filled the air. When the dust settled, the plinth was gone, and the founder's box was sliding toward a gaping hole in the floor. But more terrifying was the silence. Claudia was no longer standing by Sandra's side. Through the settling grit, a dark figure could be seen retreating into the service tunnels, clutching a small girl in a red-stained white dress. The dust from the explosion was still settling when Dragon moved. He was a blur of black silk and lethal intent, lunging into the settling grit before the smoke could clear. A single, muffled gunshot echoed from the service tunnel, followed by a grunt of pain. Seconds later, Dragon emerged from the shadows, his white shirt stained red, but his arms were wrapped tightly around a trembling Claudia. He set her down gently, his large, tattooed hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. The intruder lay neutralized in the dark, but the real monster was still in the room. Dragon turned his gaze toward Brandy, who was being pinned against a marble pillar by the clan's veteran guards. The exit strategy she had spent 7 years building had collapsed into a pile of rubble and digital evidence. "Take her," Dragon commanded, his voice vibrating with a frequency that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. "Strip her of everything. Leave her with nothing but the clothes she used to frame a mother. If I ever see her face in this city again, the earth will be her only home." As the guards dragged a screaming, hysterical Brandy into the night, the ballroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The power had been restored, and the gold seal of the founder's box glowed under the lights, a silent witness to the truth. Dragon turned toward Sandra. The coldness that had defined him for a decade had melted away, replaced by a raw, desperate hunger for redemption. He took a slow step toward her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sandra," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was blind. I let a snake poison the well of my own house. But the heavens have given us a second chance. Look at this empire. It belongs to you now. Stay. Be my queen. Let us raise our daughter in the light she deserves." The guests held their breath. Dragon reached out, his hand hovering near Sandra's cheek, offering her the very crown she had once been forced to scrub. Sandra looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the powerful dragon of Seoul, but she also saw a man who had trusted a document over the woman who had carried his child. She looked down at Claudia, then reached out and gently adjusted the fresh jasmine flowers in the girl's straight hair. 7 years ago, I stood in your foyer and begged you to see us, Sandra said, her voice a calm, steady rhythm that echoed through the silent ballroom. You chose a tower of stone over a family of flesh. You think you're offering me a throne, but I've already built a kingdom of my own. She took Claudia's hand, her grip firm and unyielding. I was your maid once, dragon. I've spent 7 years making sure I'll never be your prisoner again. You can keep your empire. It's as hollow as the man who leads it. Sandra turned her back on the dragon for the last time. As she walked toward the massive iron gates, the crowd parted like a sea of silk and shadows. She didn't look back at the kneeling boss or the shimmering gold seal. She walked out into the cool Seoul night, her head held high, the scent of jasmine trailing behind her like a promise kept. The heavy gates closed with a final, echoing thud, leaving the dragon alone in a palace of echoes, while Sandra walked toward a horizon that was finally, stubbornly hers. Kindly like and subscribe.